Good afternoon, all.
Harry,
Brian,
let's get together. Let's make communication. What's your number?
You can use the
Hello?
chat function.
Now,
Brian,
yeah. Before the rabbi starts, you've got 30 seconds.
to what? Put
Give me your telephone number.
okay.
Okay.
Becky Kavinsky, how
Pop
are
it into
you?
the chat. You can pop the numbers into the chat. Those who are looking to share details, please go ahead. I'm going to share the screen now.
Right, let's go.
Started. Hi, Jackie. Welcome. Okay, welcome to everyone. We're just on time and I'd like to get started. So, in a moment, I'll share the screen. We're moving on to today's chapter, which is chapter 5 in the laws of Torah study. And today we focus further on the relationship between student to teacher and teacher to student. Now we're going to learn a very fascinating and I would say, in a sense, rigid approach that expects a very heightened level of respect to a teacher. And as we'll see when we get close towards the end of the chapter, that this refers to a very particular type of Torah teacher. So as we go through these details, we'll recognize that we're going to define a very particular type of Torah teacher that this all refers to. Certainly, as the Rambam will also say closer to the end of the chapter, that a level of respect must be shown towards all Torah scholars and Torah teachers, but the particulars that we speak of in the earlier halachot is to your very special, what we call Rav Muvhak or Talmud Muvhak, which means, your designated main teacher and the special relationship that exists there. And of course, it also speaks to the type of character of that particular teacher, a character that is developed along the lines of what we learned in the laws of character development as the real Talmud Chacham. So we'll see all of that as we go through the laws. That's just a little word of introduction before we start moving ahead. Once again, I'm going to try read, as my preferred style is to try read as much of the Hebrew as possible, but I want to keep it into a half an hour, so I may skip some words here and there, but mostly I'll read the text as it is. I just learned a trick today how to make the text a bit bigger, so I'll do that for the benefit of everyone. And then I'll start reading. Okay, Talmud Torah chapter 5. Just as a person is commanded to honor their father and to show them in awe, so too one is obligated towards one's teacher, and in fact, even more so. And the rationale for this, as he continues, is because one's father brings us into this world, the material world, but your teacher, your Rebbe, who gives you the wisdom of Torah, is your pass into the world to come, which is even greater. And so how does this translate practically? If you happen to see an item which your father lost, and you saw an item that your teacher lost, right? We have a mitzvah to return a lost article. So your article of your teacher takes precedent over that of your father's. If his father and teacher are both carrying a heavy load and need assistance, you first assist the teacher, the Rebbe. If they have been captured, first you will redeem your teacher and then your father. This is a special mitzvah of Pidyon Shvuim. We do not allow a Jew to languish in captivity, and we'll go to all ends to make sure we get them released. But there is almost like a hierarchy of responsibility. If there's a few people and you need to get one of them out of captivity, so if it's a choice between your teacher and your father, your teacher comes first. Again, I'm going to emphasize, we're talking about a very particular type of teacher, someone, as the Rambam will describe later, from whom you learn the majority of your wisdom. But as we'll see as we go through the halachot, it's also about the type of character of this individual. It's really a pristine Talmid Chacham of the highest order, like we saw defined, as I mentioned before, in the Hilchot Dayot, the laws of character development. And what we'll see is, as we go through these halachot, is that the type of awe and respect that we show to this particular teacher is completely relates to the level in which this individual represents, so to speak, and embodies the values of Torah and represents Hashem in this world. So it's like an extension of the Yirat Shamayim, which Rama also speaks about. So the last point we had was captivity. One's teacher would come first, and he has an important proviso. He says, "V'im haya aviv talmid chacham." If one's father was also a Torah sage, then poides over tchila. Then your father comes first. And the point here is that even if he's perhaps not as advanced as your teacher per se, but he has both the qualities, then you certainly goes to your father first in all these instances. Okay, so he extends what I just said, is that even if your father is not to the same level of Talmid Chacham as the teacher, you would return his last article before that of your teacher. He says the type of respect and the type of awe that is shown to a teacher is unprecedented. Our sages have said, as I mentioned, right, that your fear of your teacher should be like that of the fear of heaven. And that's really the justification. So now he plays it out a little bit more. What are the type of things that I have to avoid? He says, anybody, therefore, who disputes the authority of his teacher, it's considered like you're disputing with Hashem himself. If you lead a revolt against a teacher, that's like revolting against Hashem. And in all these instances here, he quotes verses from the Torah, which are incidents in the experience of the Jewish people in the desert when they came out against Moshe Rabbeinu. And each time Moshe reminds them, right, like just to choose this particular quote, Lo aleinu tronai ki al Hashem. When the people come and complain to Moshe and Aaron, he reminds them that your complaint is not just against us, but what you're contesting exactly is against Hashem himself. And so all these instances, he says, whoever complains, whoever leads a revolt, whoever raises controversy, whoever comes out against his teacher, it's not just against his teacher, but ultimately it is against Hashem. In the second halakha, now he's going to explain, so what exactly does it mean to dispute against one's teacher? Because obviously we understand that learning is about sharing contrary opinions from time to time. It's about asking hard questions. If anybody's experienced learning Gemara, you'll know that Gemara is always about the back and forth, students questioning their teachers. So what does it mean not to have a dispute with one's teacher? So he defines it here, he says this refers to someone who establishes a house of study, where he establishes himself and starts to teach without his teacher's permission during his teacher's lifetime. And he says this applies even if his teacher lives in a different country. Certainly a person is forbidden, a student is forbidden to render halachic judgments in the presence of his teacher. If he renders halachic judgment in his teacher's presence, it's like he's worthy of death. What does this mean? Again, to go back to this point, we're talking here about the individual who serves really as the absolute model of commitment to Hashem and refinement of character to this student. And so what's happening is like this is, in order for the student to be receptive to the teachings, not just the teachings shared by word of mouth, but from the example of the teacher, the student has to be humble in the presence of the teacher, just as that teacher is humble in the presence of Hashem. It's the humility of the teacher that needs to be reflected in the student. So for a student to go and establish themselves as a teacher during the lifetime of his teacher without the permission of the teacher is basically saying it's an egotistical move. And in a way, it's a person is disconnecting themselves, so to speak, from their connection to Hashem even. And this is what the Rambam is saying. It's worthy almost of death if Hashem ultimately is the source of life, and I'm in that expression of going and establishing myself without that permission, I'm divesting myself from that connection. The third halacha. What does it mean in the presence? We said in the previous halacha, in the presence of your teacher, you do not render halachic judgment. So he says, if there was 12 mil is a halachic measurement, which is roughly a kilometer. So he says, if there's a 12-kilometer gap between you and your teacher, and somebody comes and asks you for direction in halacha, you can give it to them. But if you're closer, at least in those times it would seem, right? It's rather you direct the person to the teacher so they go and get it from him and you don't step forward to give that halacha. Again, this is all without the permission of the teacher, right? Here's an interesting scenario. He says, if somebody happens to be performing something that is prohibited, and you, even in the presence of the teacher, and you see what's going on, then you can stop them. Like he says, Kate, and how would this happen? So if a person is engaging in some type of prohibited behavior, either because they don't know or because they're actually being wicked, so then even though I'm a student in the presence of my teacher, I must go over to the person and tell him to stop. Why? Because in an instance where there is a desecration of the name of Hashem, which means someone is in a basically a public setting transgressing the will of Hashem, what's happening? This is creating desecration of the name of Hashem. In that moment, even the Rav, this great teacher's covered honor is deferred, and you got to do what you got to do. Now, going back to the first point, that he says you can guide someone in halacha if you're 12 miles away from your teacher. That's if it happened that someone actually came to ask you a halachic ruling. But to establish myself as an address where people can come and get directives in halacha, that I can't do. Similar to, like we said before, you can't establish a place of learning, even if you're on the other end of the world. This is so long as your teacher is alive, or so long as you have not yet been directed by him or received permission from your teacher to do so. If one has been directed by a teacher to go and teach themselves, or one has asked for permission and they've been granted that permission, then one may do that. And further, a final point he says, yeah, and just because we're talking out that this all applies during a teacher's lifetime, it doesn't mean that as soon as one's teacher passes away, that automatically you as an individual are now qualified to start giving directives in halacha, but certainly you have to have the qualifications necessary as well. The fourth halacha. Now, if somebody steps forward and starts to render judgments when they don't have the correct knowledge and capacity to do so, such a person is called foolish, wicked, and arrogant, as the verse says, she has cast down many corpses. And this, as the Rambam says, applies to such an individual. But by conversely, what about someone who is worthy of rendering halachic judgments? They have the talent, they have the capacity, they have the knowledge. And they refrain from giving directives. And then this person is considered to be holding back Torah and ultimately placing stumbling block before the blind. Because you have the capacity, people need that guidance. Things are not clear in this world. And if you have the capacity, you therefore have the responsibility, and not doing so, you become liable for the results of that. And he just quotes references to this idea. He says those underdeveloped students who gather, who have not got so much Torah knowledge, and they push themselves to the front in order to lift themselves up, they cause major problems. It says, like he says here, it spreads division, ultimately destroys the world, and extinguishes the light of Torah, wreaks havoc on the vineyard of the God of hosts. Because what happens is people give wrong information. People end up, essentially behaving in ways that are disrespectful of one another. Inaccurate practices come into place, and this just causes disintegration, so to speak, of that society, and ultimately it wreaks havoc. He says on the vineyard of Hashem's host, the true and beautiful vineyard of the Torah itself. And furthermore, he says it increases, it gets considered to destroy the world by increasing dissension, and so on and so forth. He says, about such people, King Solomon says, take for us foxes, little foxes that spoil the vineyards. Our vineyards are blooming. So, someone who's not correctly qualified, who puts themselves forward, can create big problems. Halacha hey. So another directive. A student is forbidden to refer to his teacher by their first name, even if you're not in their presence. Now, he does qualify this. He says this is so long as the teacher's name is somewhat unusual, so people know that it's the name of his teacher. In other words, if it's a name like Yosef or Chaim or Moshe, and many people have that, then you would be able to use that name. He says, in front of a teacher, you should not say their name, even if you're not referring to the teacher, but to somebody else. That they have the same name as his teacher. This law is the same law that we have when it comes to honoring our parents. One does not call their father by their first name. One does not use their father's first name to refer to others in their father's presence. Just as an aside, if one would preface it with a title, my rabbi, my teacher, so-and-so, then it's different. We're talking about just using the name as is when we're not in their presence. He says here, even after the teacher has passed away, you should change the name of somebody else that you're referring to, so that it shouldn't be that you're using your teacher's name just kind of flippantly, even if you're not referring to your teacher, but you're referring to somebody else. So if you have a friend who's got an unusual name that's the same unusual name that your teacher had, you should refer to them slightly differently than the way you would have referred, or the name of the teacher would have been used. And this obviously maintains that sense of reverence for the honor of the teacher. Similarly, as a display of awe, one does not just flippantly greet their teacher like they would to everybody else. And similarly, you wouldn't respond the same way we respond to others. It's not like, how's it? And you respond, how's it? But if the teacher does greet you first, then one should respond with humility and with a sense of awe and a sense of respect. Like he says here, if his teacher greeted him, he should respond, peace be upon you, my teacher and master. Halacha 6. And other things, one should not remove their tefillin in the presence of their teacher. One should not recline, like we do on Pesach, leaning over to the side when you're in the presence of a teacher, but sit upright like you would in the presence of a king. Oh, sorry, I missed one. One should not pray not immediately in front of, not immediately behind, and not immediately to the side. And certainly one should not walk alongside his teacher, like always. And I keep saying teacher, I must remember the prize. We're talking about the Rebbe. We're talking about a true Rebbe figure over here. One should not just walk alongside like we buddies. So when davening or when walking, one should be behind and slightly off to the side. One should not enter into a bathhouse together with his Rebbe. One should not sit in their designated seat. One should not argue with what he's saying. In other words, if he's in this happens to be in a discussion with others, don't take the opposing view in the presence of your rabbi. You should not contradict him. When you're in his presence, don't sit until you've been instructed to sit. Don't get up until you've asked for permission to get up, or he's told you to get up. When one leaves the presence of such a teacher, don't turn your back and walk away. You step backwards so that you're facing him as you're taking leave of this teacher. Halacha Zayin 7. One is obligated to stand before his teacher as soon as you see him coming from the distance, and you remain standing until he's out of eyesight. Then you can sit. And there's a mitzvah to go and greet one's teachers on the regel. Regel is a reference to the three festivals of Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. And that's why people, there are pilgrimages, so to speak, to the courts of the great Rebbe's over the holiday times in accordance with this particular halakha. If you happen to be in the presence of a great teacher and his student, and even if this student in his own right is a great teacher and rabbi, you do not extend a special kind of honor to that individual unless this teacher himself, the Rebbe himself, has deferred some of that honor. Now it's important. The person says that one should be willing, one should in fact do the types of activities that a servant would do for their master, the student should do for his teacher. So what happens if they're traveling and people don't know that this individual is a student, not actually a servant? And he says, furthermore, he doesn't have his tefillin. So what's going to happen is he's standing, he doesn't have tefillin, and he's going to just look like a servant. Because people are going to assume that he's a servant and not a student, then it's possible then he doesn't have to do such activities like helping him tie his shoelaces or take off the shoes for him, which is the type of things that a servant might do and a student should be willing to do and should do, but not if he's going to be mistaken for a servant, then he wouldn't have to do it. And yeah, this is a directive to the teacher himself. If the teacher or this Rebbe kind of stops his student from assisting him in this type of way, he says what you're actually doing is you are denying him a kindness, and you also are removing a little bit of the fear of heaven from him. This comes back to the point that we said at the beginning. The whole basis of this idea is that we're talking about an individual. This teacher is the embodiment of Torah values, one who lives humbly before Hashem with an absolute humility. So it's not really, ultimately, it's not really his honor, it's Hashem's honor. So if you don't allow somebody to serve you in that way, you're actually denying them that the opportunity of kindness and in a sense, removing a bit of Yirat Shamayim from them. And anybody who dishonors their student causes the divine presence to depart from Israel. And again, along the lines of what we just explained. Halacha test, ninth halacha. What happens if you see your teachers transgressing an instruction in the Torah? Now, it might be either by mistake or whatever the cause for it might be. So he tells us the correct way to approach the teacher. You should say, Limadatanu Rabbeinu kach v'kach. Say, my dear teacher, you have taught us such and such. In other words, which is different to the way I'm seeing you to behave now. Similarly, anytime he shares a teaching, he should say, this is what our teacher, have taught us. Now, a student who teaches, a known student of a particular Rebbe, it's assumed that whatever he's teaching he received from his teacher. So he doesn't have to repeat every time that it's coming from his particular teacher. But if he happens to be teaching something from somebody else, it's important that he mentions that. Otherwise, the assumption is that it's coming from his teacher. And we don't want the teaching to be misascribed. It's a very important idea that we have in halakha and generally, that we want to ascribe the authorship of an idea to the correct author. By the way, there's a mystical concept over here, is that the kind of the author of all of existence is Hashem, and ultimately we want to ascribe it to its original author. But part of that idea is that we ascribe a teaching to the teacher that we've learned it from. And as we learned by the Megillah, that brought about Geula, that brought about redemption in the world, because it's part of the process of bringing Hashem to the forefront of existence constantly by ascribing the correct authorship of any teaching. Anyway, so we continue. When a person's teacher, and again, this is his established lifelong teacher, passes away, one is to tear kriya. You rent your garments all the way down to reveal your heart. And those garments should not be repaired. Now everything, this is the proviso here. Everything that we said, as I mentioned to you, is what he calls Rabbi Muvhak, which he translates here. How does he translate? To one's outstanding teacher. And how does he define what is the Rabbi Muvhak? Who is the outstanding teacher? He says the one person who's provided you with the majority of your wisdom. Okay, I just say this word muvhak is associated with a word which is to light up. It's the individual who has given you your shine. It's the teacher who has given you your fire and your capacity to bring warmth and shine beyond. But if you're talking about a Torah teacher is not being your primary teacher, your outstanding teacher, then we refer to this individual as I'm a student colleague. One does not have to go to the extent of all these expressions of respect that we've spoken about. But there is a level of respect. What you should do is one should stand for him. Similarly, if the person passes away, one would rent a garment, even though not through all their garments. And you should show signs of mourning like you would for other relatives. And he says, what is the definition of somebody who's a teacher? Even if you've only learned one thing from them, whether it's a small thing or big thing, one would have to show a level of respect and even display some level of mourning, even as we said, it's not to the same degree as one would for their Rav Muvhak. The 10th halacha, the whole Talmud, Chacham, Shedayosim Mechuvanis, and any proper student with proper character will not speak in front of anyone who is wiser than he, right? Not only not in front of his teacher. If the person is wiser than him, even if you haven't learned from that person, in other words, in the presence of a Torah sage, even if he's not your teacher, and even if you haven't learned from him, one still has to behave with a certain level of respect and reverence. Now, here's something interesting, because we may have seen people doing some of these things in the presence of an individual that we would have expected who is their Rav Muvhak. So the halacha tells us like this: Harav Muvhak, this outstanding teacher, who wishes to forgo this honor in all these matters that we've spoken about, whether it's for one individual student or for all his students, harashus b'yoda, it's within his right to do so. You can say, I forgo that honor, and that's fine. But just a final reminder to the student: nonetheless, there's a level of respect that one still must show, as we've said previously, to every Talmid Chacham, to every wise Torah sage. One has to act with a level of reverence. So certainly it would apply to one's Rav Muvhak, even if that teacher has chosen to forego that particular honor. Now, here's an interesting thing, because it tells us that this is not just a one-way relationship, and it's not just a one-way level of respect. Just as students are obligated to honor their teachers, a teacher has to show honor to his students. And furthermore, he has to bring them in, he has to embrace them. And this is what I said. One should honor their students, or the honor of one's students should be more dear to them than your own honor. And this is important. He says a teacher has to care for his students and has to love his students. Because our students are like our children. That will bring this person nachas, basically, in this world and in the world to come. So this is an incredibly important idea. If you want to really, this is another aspect of the character of this teacher, that he has respect, love for his student as well. And obviously part of the appreciation that the teacher has for his students, because he recognizes that it's his students who broaden his understanding. As our sages have said, I've learned much from my teachers, I've learned more from my friends, and most of all, I've learned from my students. He says, just like a small little twig or branch can ignite a big flame, get the beam kind of alight, the big branch alight, so too the small student, so to speak, ignites the teacher to expand his understanding, to expand his wisdom, and bring out the teacher's own brilliance. And this is where the teacher's appreciation for the student comes in. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this chapter of Halakha. I'm going to stop the screen share and stop this.